Welcome to Literary Ramblings Podcast, brought to you by Endeavor Brewing and Spirits in Columbus, Ohio. We are four friends who have been in the book club that's gathered for more than a decade. We read serious fiction, and this podcast reflects our discussion and collaborative analysis. We provide some context and background info, but it is by no means a comprehensive analysis, simply a conversation amongst friends. There will be spoilers, so if you haven't read the novel and would prefer not to hear plot points, please pause this now, go read the book, and then press play. Hi everyone, I'm Scott.
I'm Kevin.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Joe.
Today we are discussing the Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which was published anonymously in 1824. The author was James Hogg. So I first encountered this lesser-known classic work while reading literature at the University of Edinburgh. At the time, I'd never heard of it, but I've remained deeply impressed with the work and wanted to see what our little group felt about it and its place and stature within the literary tradition. Has anyone here ever heard of that book before I mentioned it?
No.
I think I'd heard of James Hogg, but I had not heard of this.
Yeah, and I hadn't heard of the book or the writer.
Either.
It's certainly sort of a secondary tier that has circles of influence, but has an interesting backstory. I know Joe will get a little bit into that in a few minutes, but it is an everyman's library option. It's a Penguin classic, evidenced by my lovely hardback edition here in front of us, and it is canonical to a degree. There's even been a modern literary adaptation. There's been an opera, and the possibility of an upcoming major streaming network film or series.
Really?
Yeah, we'll talk about
interesting.
that during the
Could be a good
quiz, actually.
Yeah, that actually could be interesting.
Yeah. So it's a relatively short novel, and it doesn't easily fit into a singular category. It might accurately or inaccurately be described as gothic, historical, horror, psychological, political, religious, satirical, comical, romantic. Modern lens readings can certainly dig into Freudian, homoerotic, feminist, new historical, various structural versions, and it even has multiple elements of what we might consider postmodern or metafiction. It plays heavily on the idea of a doppelganger, possession, twins, things happening in multiples of two, including two major sections from two distinct perspectives. Holding aside whether it completely holds up under every interpretation, I personally find Confessions to be a structural masterpiece. It's a tale told in two large sections and a short third section. It reveals the same worldly events through multiple perspectives, with enough contradiction to make us question all narration as not being even remotely reliable. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Joe for a brief bio.
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting because when you start to read about James Hogg, you would never suspect that he became a writer when you look at his background. And, you know, and even when he died, he was relatively an obscure writer, and his writing actually lost reputation, his name and his work as as the years went on. And he wasn't actually rediscovered until, he died in 1835, and he was maybe rediscovered in 1920s. So almost 100 years after he died, this novel was kind of resurfaced and started to be examined as a serious work of literature. And this is really, as far as I can tell, now Scott, you know differently, this is really the only thing that scholars are still like kind of really digging into when you look at James Hogg. I mean, I think there might be some hardcore, like, you know, Scottish literary scholars who are going to go deeper into his body of work, but this is definitely his seminal work.
Sure thing. I think he was a poet first, and
Yeah.
that's how he made his name for himself, was within a strong local Scottish following for his use, much like Robert Burns, of Scots dialect within poetry. Then he wrote a lot of journalistic, newspaper, magazine, shorter articles, but this is his only real novel.
Yeah, so he was born in 1770, and he was born on a small farm on the Scottish borders. And his exact birthday isn't even recorded. That's how like kind of rural and you know he was and his family was. He came into the world without a pedigree, and he was offered very little in the way of formal education. His father was a struggling tenant farmer, and the only thing that his family actually contributed to his writing is his mother had a hobby of collecting Scottish ballads and stories. And these would later become kind of some of the inspiration for his work. His schooling lasted very briefly before his family fell into bankruptcy, and he had to start working. And he basically worked as a farmer in the field, or actually for farmers, tending cows, herding sheep, but working basically as a farmhand just to make any money he could. And he had to teach himself actually how to read. And he did that just by any spare time he had. He would read from the Bible or borrowed books or whatever scraps of newspapers or magazines or anything he could find. And then eventually that kind of farm life turned into just being a full-time shepherd. And it was during those long solitary stretches that he began reading more seriously. And that took us to like 1790. So he's like almost 20 years old now. And at that point, he discovers Robert Burns, who you mentioned, Scott. And he realized that if Burns could write about and from rural life, that maybe he could too. And he decided that he wanted to try his hand at writing. However, it's not a quick transition. It's more of a gradual transition, almost forced, because the first thing he does, though, is he's still interested in writing, but he decides he wants to try to buy a farm and become a farmer. And that fails miserably. He ends up deep in debt, and at the same time he gets involved with an unmarried a woman he's not married to, has a child outside of that marriage, and things get so overwhelming with the child, with the debt, that he actually runs away from the whole thing in disgrace. I'm not sure historically what happened to that woman or that child, but I'm sure if you wanted to look deeper into that, you might be able to find some stuff out there.
That child is Scott.
There you go.
Dun, dun, dun. Reveal.
Scott is much older than he looks.
Yeah. I'm sorry. For our listeners, that's not true, as far as we know.
So finally in 1810, when he's now almost 40 years old, he finally lands in Edinburgh, where he's now seriously going to try to become a professional writer. And in Edinburgh, he, at the time, am I saying this wrong, Kevin?
Edinburgh.
Edinburgh. You don't say Berg, man.
Well, I mean, I'm
It's not the pits here.
I'm Croatian. So. So at the time, this was basically one of the literary capitals of Britain, and it was dominated by figures like Walter Scott, who Hogg admired. And so in 1813, now he's 43, he publishes his first successful poem, which is called The Queen's Wake, and it's a long narrative poem framed as a storytelling contest in the court of Mary, Queen of Scots. The success of the poem allowed Hogg to join a writing team that wrote for this magazine called Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. Edinburgh?
Better.
You got to kind of roll it.
I'm not going to do that. This was one of the most influential literary journals of the time. And this gave him good exposure at first, but ultimately it turned him into a sort of a caricature because one of the magazine's most popular reoccurring segments was some of the writers in the magazine would make up kind of fictional personas for themselves. And Hogg assumed the persona of what became known as the Ettrick Shepherd. It was kind of a half comic, half savage figure, kind of genius and fool mixed together, this very rural person who had some literary background. And this caricature actually kind of stuck, and almost like an actor who can't escape from a sitcom character, he's trying to get away from this caricature for pretty much the rest of his life. And the public and even the literary community basically start to see him as kind of a bumbling, self-styled intellectual, and view him as almost like he's very ambitious, but his skills aren't there. So they never really respect him, even in his lifetime. So even with that, he still was able, though, to continue to eke out a living and publish poems, songs, essays, novels. And finally, in 1824, he publishes the seminal work, The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which we're talking about today. This is not well received. It doesn't sell well at first. In fact, there's only 900 copies published and only about 300 of them sold in the first year, which makes me feel good about my book, which has sold about 100 copies at this point.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah, we're still in the first year, so I just got to get 200 more copies, and I can say, well, hey, I sold as many as James Hogg did in his first.
And then in 100 years, Penguin will do an edition for you.
Yeah. So later, his years were marked by financial instability, ongoing disputes with publishers, and declining health. And he continued writing, but money problems never really left him. In 1833, he fell through ice, which triggered a serious illness he never fully recovered from. And he died in 1835 at 65 years of age, and he's buried near his childhood home. The British Romantic poet William Wordsworth wrote a tribute calling him a mighty minstrel, but then in private noted that he was coarse and offensive. Tension between admiration and condescension defined Hogg's entire reputation. Years after his death, Victorian editors sanitized his work, and thus Victorian readers who encountered a diluted version of Hogg concluded he was overrated. And this reputation lasted until 1924 when the French writer André Gide read Confessions, and he called it one of the most powerful books he had ever read. This comment sparked a revival, and the novel was republished, re-examined, and eventually recognized for what it was. Today, Confessions is considered one of the great Scottish novels. Scholars continue to rediscover and reassess Hogg's broader body of work, and there's even a James Hogg Society dedicated to studying him.
Yeah, and Joe, something you said there, I'm going to maybe expand on really quickly, too. I think that you mentioned that, how to pronounce it, but I think when you mentioned that a lot of his contemporary critics had thought that he was lower on skill, I think that's not quite, I think what Wordsworth was saying was really more to the point, and that's they appreciated his genius, his skill, but they didn't like where he came from. He was a poor shepherd from a poor part of the countries, from a country itself that was frowned upon by the academic elite of the time, which was dominated by England and French influence.
Right.
So Scotland were seen as being these backwoods hicks.
And he's self-educated on top of it.
And
right?
he's
Correct.
like the most hick of the hicks.
The most hick of
yeah.
it. He was a hick because Burns himself was fairly educated and well-read, but decided to make the point of writing in the local dialect and really put that on the map and garnered a level of literary respect, whereas Hogg was sort of writing what he knew.
Do you guys have the intro in the Penguin?
I read it on my phone, so
Yeah,
Okay.
who wrote your intro?
Well, I don't know, but I was just
The reason I ask is have you read anything by Gide?
Uh-uh.
Anyway, I read him. I was introduced to him in a course called Literature and Existentialism, where writers were paired with existentialists, and kind of here's a novel that kind of reflects this person's philosophy. So I discovered André Gide in that class. I might not be saying his name correctly. He's French.
I think it is Gide. Yeah.
But he wrote a really important introduction to the 1947 republication of the book that was so even though he claimed in the 20s is when he started championing the book, the really important reproduction of the book came out in 1947, and Gide had a really important kind of introduction to that. So I was wondering if that's the one in your book.
No, this one's Carl Miller, but I was just curious because half of Carl Miller's introduction is like defending Hogg as the actual author. So I was wondering if either of you are going to speak to it. Maybe it'll come up later, or maybe this was just something Miller was very into. He was like,
right away, people knew who wrote this.
Okay, so
but
I wonder,
it was published anonymously. You're right. We mentioned that, and then
there's some fun facts that we'll get into
exactly.
a little bit later.
Okay, well, Miller's introduction suggests that there was some doubting that someone as uneducated as Hogg could have written it.
Oh, for sure.
And so he spent 10 pages just trying to convince me, the modern reader, that Hogg really wrote it.
And we'll get into some parallels. Like I have some things to say about this novel and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and also some parallels with Don Quixote. But when you think about it, Shakespeare is the same way. You know, Shakespeare is a person that's often suspected of how could this guy who we don't know anything about his actual training or education, how did he end up writing this stuff?
We also have within canonical literature, there is a deep level of elitism and classism that especially has to be reconciled when it comes to the Scottish versus English mentality.
Yeah.
The British like to assume anyone who's good is British. You'll literally, if you pick up on it, you'll hear this, and they'll talk about good authors as being British and bad authors as being Scottish.
Yeah, I've been reading Boswell's Life of Johnson slowly but surely. I'm about 1,700 pages into the edition.
Oh
I'm
my
reading.
word!
And one of the
That's when
recurring themes is that Johnson is constantly bad-mouthing Scotland.
Yeah.
In sort of a joking way because Boswell was Scottish. So he's always kind of throwing him what is it? Throwing him under the, why am I blanking on the phrase?
Under the bus?
He's throwing him under the bus.
I thought you were
exactly.
looking for a Scottish equivalent.
I'm not. I'm just
Throws
I'm
him
just
under the
tired.
trolley.
Under the Lord.
Under the trolley.
Under the Pete. Under the Pete.
But yeah, it's like, we'll give you a pass, Boswell. You're one of the good Scots.
That's good.
Scott, I'm going to show my ignorance here. What relationship is there between Britain and Scotland when Hogg is living?
We'll get into that a little bit during the quiz. I actually
Okay.
have some historical context that will
Okay.
be brought out at that time. But
they're functioning
short
as
answer.
independent countries at this point, or not?
no,
Maybe there's
no,
a question about that,
Okay.
Joe.
Not exactly. Yeah. So I mean, the British Isles as a whole has a long history, and specifically the Scottish-English border back to pre-Roman times. I mean, Hadrian's Wall was built when the Romans couldn't defeat the Picts, which were some of the ancestral peoples in Scotland. They built a wall across the north of England, the south of Scotland, to block them off. And there were wars of Malcolm III fell off a cliff, and that inspired, if you've seen Braveheart and the whole battles leading up to that. And
Sure he wasn't pushed off a cliff
Well,
by someone?
By a
not according to
mysterious
legend.
figure in the mist.
And it was a lot of back and forth and back and forth. So at this time, there was definitely two big political parties that came out in this book as well. And effectively, one was backing the royalists, or the people who had been exiled as royalty, and the others were backing sort of the parliamentarians who Oliver Cromwell, they had assassinated Charles I and had a whole civil war and kind of taken over Scotland as part of the larger kingdom as well.
Were they backing the House of Stuart?
Stuarts, yes.
So Jacobites?
That's part of it too. There might be a quiz question
Okay.
Ooh.
around some of these overlapping themes as well.
Sounds
All right,
like
so
we are
before we
all
get-
ready to
Yeah.
dominate Joe.
Before we get too far into that, maybe, Scott, you had a little
Yeah.
plot summary for us.
Yeah. So let's get into the plot and talk about the book. So the story obviously set in Scotland. The events take place at the very end of the 1600s, but mostly at the beginning of the 1700s. And certainly a pivotal time, as we were just discussing, in the nation's long, winding history. The first 80 pages or so are the editor's narrative, and the editor in question remains anonymous, as the novel was published as such, although we see a bit more about that person in the short third section at the very end of the book. We meet Laird George Colwyn of Dalcastle, who is to marry a Lady Robina Ord. She's of a rather particular and extreme political beliefs, and the Lord is more liberal. He enjoys such rampant sins as dancing and drinking alcohol with friends. Needless to say, the two do not get along and end up immediately separated in different parts of the grand estate, but technically under the same roof. The Laird has a regular female friend who is later employed in the household. The lady has a close reverend friend. And as a result of these relationships, a son. George Colwyn is born and recognized as the son and heir to the estate. A second son, Robert, is born. And although never explicitly stated, it's heavily implied that he's actually the son of the Reverend Ringham. The sons are brought up and raised separately with two different parental social and religious upbringings. George is a handsome, athletic, social young man and a spitting image of the Scottish aristocratic ideal. Robert is dark, brooding, lacking friends, and instructed in the strict religious teachings of his father and mother. So years go by, and the two brothers meet up as young adults in Edinburgh, where Robert starts following and pestering George in mocking and obnoxious manners. There are scuffles, incidents, bloodshed, a rather comical, massive mob riot between competing political parties. There's arrests and court appearances, and George retreats into hiding to avoid his shadow. But after some time, he finally ventures out early one morning all alone up a prominent mountain called Arthur's Seat. As George is sitting in the morning fogs, he sees a frightening, shadowy face in the clouds, and when he turns sharply to escape, he runs directly into Robert, who is apparently crouched behind him and about to push him down from the edge of a cliff. So stuff gets dicey, there's some legal proceedings, but ultimately the courts vindicate George as the victim of the scenario. But, George is found murdered, stabbed in the back after a drunken night out celebrating with his young contingent of friends. and a friend who is celebrating with the group is accused, but he maintains his innocence, but he still flees the country. George's father dies shortly thereafter, grieving his son, and Robert inherits the entire estate, where things don't go so well. Eventually, a witness is found, and a second, who testify that the accused man couldn't have done it, but it was a person dressed as and with the appearance of him. And there was a second accomplice who actually did the stabbing, a second person later proven to be none other than Robert Ringham. So the second part of the book is a little over 100 pages, and it's the first-person narration by Robert Ringham. He retells the story from his own perspective. Unlike the outward, event-based, almost journalistic report of the editor's version, Robert's memoir is about his internal perceptions and feelings as it relates to the world around him. We find that his reverend father has declared him as justified, meaning that according to strict Calvinist teachings, he was one of the preordained persons who are automatically saved and granted access to heaven, and nothing he can do can change this outcome. Then that very same day he receives the news, he meets a mysterious stranger who resembles him exactly and has the supernatural ability to take on the appearance and know the thoughts of anyone around him that he studies. We know this man only as Gilmartin. This friend leads Robert down a dark path, pushing the idea of predestination to a ridiculous level, and eventually has him commit multiple murders for the righteous cause. He does in fact kill his brother. He has periods where he's acting in tandem with Gilmartin, others where it seems he's blacked out and has no memory of long stretches of time, but others accuse him of heinous crimes. Finally, as the world around him is collapsing, he escapes and winds his way first to Edinburgh, where he pauses, working at a printer where he manages to create a pamphlet of his memoirs, and eventually travels south, being pursued by his mysterious friend. Finally, he finds himself employed farming cattle in the borderlands and is convinced by this friend to take his own life. These final few moments are told as a sporadic and limited diary entries. So the third part of the novel is a mere dozen or so pages and returns to the contemporary timeline of the anonymous editor. He frames the story as stemming from a magazine article published in 1823 called A Scots Mummy. The article describes gravediggers opening up a centuries-old suicide tomb only to discover a body that had not decomposed at all. The editor is fascinated and digs into extensive research. When he, along with several other scholars, archaeologists, and locals, after a brief and pointless meeting with the author of the article, one James Hogg, visit the grave in question, they exhume the lower half of the body and find the manuscript and diary that is presented in the text of the novel. Funny enough, this was a real article published in the magazine, actually published by James Hogg a year before the novel was ever published. So the book has some notable influence, especially inspiration for the famous Jekyll and Hyde, amongst others. It's been credited with a psychological awareness long before its time, and some scholars even arguing it diagnoses schizophrenia before any such diagnosis existed. So with that, I'd like the group's take. I know Joe has some criticism to bring in as well, but I'd also like to hear what you guys' first reactions were.
I'll be honest. I found it a bit tiresome, and I was not the biggest fan, and I think that I'm excited to talk about it because I think part of my frustration with the book in general was like this satirical critique of like the position that no one holds, like the kind of the classic notion of that's a really robust critique of like something no one cares about, no one believes. And what I mean,
you mean the idea of once you're one of the selected few, there you can do nothing to cancel that. There's no evil deed you could do that would get you unselected. Yeah,
and I think that's where I'm hoping that some of the historical context, the conversation will flesh this out for me, because I'm like, I mean, Wes and I exist in like a religious tradition where like I've never met a person whose like interpretation of sovereignty or predestination is even remotely approaching the absurdity of the characters of this book. So for me, a lot of it was just kind of exhausting, where I'm like, yeah, we get it, but like, who are you critiquing? I've never met a human being or heard of one who believes the object of the satire. And I'm like, for me, I don't know, satirizing a thing that doesn't exist feels tiresome. So that was my experience.
I wanted to say something too, to add to that particular thought. Ringham actually wasn't a very good Calvinist in his beliefs, aside from the fact that he's an immoral guy, pretty clearly. But I mean, like, he's not even consistent. So he talks about when he's talking to presumably his son, right? He says that, let's see, he had wrestled with God as the patriarch of old had done, not for a night, but for days and years, and that in bitterness and anguish of spirit on my account, but that he had at last prevailed and had now gained the long and earnestly desired assurance of my acceptance with the Almighty. So he apparently convinces God that this is the way to go.
That right? Robert is of the elect.
Let me tell you why Robert's elect.
But I want to qualify and say, I thought the book was hilarious. I actually laughed out loud.
It had some funny moments.
One of my favorites being the description of tennis.
Oh yeah,
as vain, idle, sinful, and a sink of sin
by Robert.
Robert. Yeah. And I was so there were a lot of moments of the book that I was.
But he didn't even know what it was, right?
Yes, he did.
Because you only know it's tennis when you put it together with the description from the editor.
Yeah, right. Until you hear the other half. But
well, I guess maybe reading it from a person who's not in a Calvinistic tradition, to me it was easy to make the leap to any radicalized fanatical religious
a broader commentary
when we see for example an Islamic terrorist who believes that it is perfectly fine to blow yourself up and to take many people with you, and that all this is going to be for the glory of God.
Or Pete Hegseth saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The religious right in our country.
And we've seen radical individuals who've made these kinds of decisions that they're working in because they've been somehow instructed by some higher power, and they're doing God's work. Although from anybody else looking at what they're doing is tremendously damaging and immoral. Yeah. So to me, it wasn't that hard to see that as this twisted belief system. Yeah. And I guess my other question, I have two questions about then in actual Calvinistic doctrine. Do people within Calvinism or their sects of Calvinists who believe that they can identify who's part of the chosen and who's not part of the chosen, or is it always kind of, I'm not sure?
To my knowledge, I don't know many or any who would claim certainty. I haven't experienced that as like a part of.
Well, since we've established them several centuries old, like if you go back to 300 years ago when the events of this novel were taking place,
then maybe you do have this.
But I think what's important to remember here is that those concepts absolutely existed and were prominent in a huge political and religious force. And in Scotland at the time, you could not separate political from religious.
Right. And I think
just in the same way you can't separate supporting Celtic and Rangers today from Catholicism and Protestant.
So Scott, I agree with what you're saying, and I feel like what's happening here is we're going to have to have two different conversations during this pod. Yeah. One is putting the novel in its historical perspective.
Correct.
And that would be reading it and learning about the history that it represents and how it spins that history. And then the second question to me, which is more interesting, is does the novel speak to the contemporary world today?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Good.
And that was going to be my next point, is that even though those viewpoints existed at the time, I think Hogg's critique is not the specificity of the viewpoints, but any viewpoint taken to an extreme. And I have a quote from the book, from page 109 in my edition, and he says, "Religion is a sublime and glorious thing, the bounds of society on earth, and the connector of humanity with the divine nature, but there is nothing so dangerous to man as wresting of any of its principles or forcing them beyond their due bounds. This is of all others the readiest way to destruction. Neither is there anything so easily done. There is not an error into which a man cannot fall, which he may not press Scripture into his service as proof of the probity of."
I highlighted that too, Scott.
Is that Gill speaking, or is that in the narrative?
No, that is the first person they kill. That is the other competing minister.
Oh, Henchard.
Reverend, who they kill because his such radical idea.
Who's like the one guy in the book who sounded like an actual real religious person who had real beliefs.
This guy is a Christian.
Yeah.
Right. Which then immediately introduces the idea that either Robert is slowly becoming crazy and this Gil guy doesn't exist at all. It's just a figment of his imagination, like kind of the devil on his shoulder, or he actually is some kind of satanic force who's trying to wipe out the actual religious people around the community.
Like actually do real destruction to real
Right.
believers, so to speak.
And that part was pretty vague, I think intentionally, because there are a number of times when other people in the book supposedly see Gilmartin, right? But then there are other times when it seems like they're not seeing him.
Yeah, that he's
So
not.
it's very ambiguous.
By design. There are
Right.
so many contradictions.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And I think I appreciate, I think that's right, that like there's a conversation about the book in its time and the book now. And probably what I'm feeling is like reading the book now is sort of like if a very serious modern writer today like penned a very serious literary satire of like the flat earth community. And you'd be like, okay, but no one no real person believes, like that's not
This would be more like the MAGA ultra-religious right
that
taken to some extremes.
Even,
American
even more
exceptionalism
than
and white.
Tim O'Brien's book we just read. What was that?
Oh
America
yeah,
Fantastica.
America Fantastica. Yeah.
So
I do think that it does resonate in today's world, especially with our political situation we have going on right now. We have, we have a president who, as long as he's been president, has never admitted he's made a mistake. He's never admitted he's done anything wrong, ever. We have his fans, his supporters who fly flags that say Trump was right about everything. Wake up, America.
Yeah.
I've seen these flags on my neighbors' homes. Trump was right about everything.
Yeah.
And
is incapable of being wrong or doing wrong.
It's like he's, this infallibility of this man
He's justified.
Is justification, right, for anything he wants to do, including if he wants to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age, as he calls it, the Stone Ages, but there's only one, so the Stone Age. And, and I'm like, well, what about the everyday people who live in Iran? What about the children? What about the non-political people who just happen to live there? Okay, we don't have to get into this.
We're spiraling.
Right, but the point being that we do have an elected official who's had a very powerful position, who completely seems to believe that he can do anything he wants to do, and that his judgment is mostly infallible, if not completely infallible.
He is elected. He is justified.
Yeah.
Right.
Justified, yeah. I think maybe...
And when he wasn't elected, it was scammed. It was a...
Right.
And,
That's good.
As we
He is the
know
elect.
from Trey and Matt, he is in bed with the devil.
I'm not following that.
South Park.
That's the South Park
Okay.
reference.
I'm like, that's over my head.
And we don't have to just go to Trump here. I mean, we've seen it. We can go before the novel, and we can say Don Quixote is another example of a person who's completely convinced that his view is the right view, no matter how often he's slapped in the face. And we see this with religious and non-religious, anybody who has an idea and that becomes so central to their being that they close their mind and are no longer willing to consider any other option, and that they might be wrong.
And I think that's good. I guess where I'm a little skeptical, that it feels to me at this point in time like it's generous to give Hogg like the full breadth of credit, that like, no, the critique is much broader than this. He meant any fanaticism, because I'm like, maybe, and I'm willing to be convinced of that. And I do think the quote is valid, but I think that's a tricky argument for a book that is very, very consistently specific about one very, very, very narrow range of commentary.
It's an interesting thing you just did, which is and it brings up a whole question of how we approach literature. Is it only what the writer intended?
Yeah.
Or does the art eventually take on a life of its own? So
Right.
even if Hogg didn't intend that, can we still say it's there?
Can it stand as that
and
today?
And I would contend that Hogg also makes fun of the other side. Like, he's equally pointing out the royalists and the people on the other in their absurdities and this affluence of youth in this kind of wanton ways. And like he's pointing out those absurdities of both of the extreme parties that were in power at the time.
I can see too, whether it was intended or not, I think I read it more as a critique of all extremes, like you were saying, Joe. But I'm a sucker for the metafiction that this book does provide and do pretty well. And I thought just from a stylistic standpoint that it was and remained pretty interesting that the whole time. I like that you're hearing about the events from a couple different perspectives.
It's weird we just read Shadow Country too.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And reading that book is what made me think of this book, because we were getting into talks about Calvinists and talks about those differences.
That's good.
I was thinking of a couple things. I was thinking of the work of Flann O'Brien, specifically like Third Policeman. I was also thinking of Tristram Shandy too. Same kind of playfulness, also very early, although I think Tristram Shandy was before this. Yeah, but maybe not a whole lot. I want to say that was 1700s.
Lawrence Stern, and it was after. Well, it was after the chronological events of this book, but before the publication, 1759 to 1767.
Okay, yeah.
So nearly contemporary. That's I mean, did you guys think of this book as like, if you had to, I mean, you said this, Scott, I think like it somewhat defies genre cataloging, but like, did you think of it as you read it experientially as like mostly a work of satire?
I don't know. I honestly, I thought that I do think there's some funny parts in the book, but I also found Gil Martin's character to be pretty disturbing in a few points where it's like, oh yeah, this guy is like really evil. He's a deceiver. And so I thought that there are elements of horror, there are elements of comedy, but I guess I just read it as like, this is really clever metafiction. It's saying a lot of different things, not always very clearly.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think it actually reads best as postmodern metafiction, like
especially
150 years before the world knew what that was.
Which is kind of, which is wild to consider.
But at the end, you know, he's getting this account ready and he's typed up a lot of it, but then things go awry with the printing house and he can't proceed. I mean, that is complete metafiction,
because
right?
Gil Martin shows up at the printing press.
Yeah.
Right. So one question I had,
and that's the real horror part too, where his face is like, he doesn't want to turn around and look at his face. It like really feels like a horror film at that moment.
Yeah.
And I think the clearest indication of Gil Martin is most likely the devil is when you see that he's actually in pain at the various moments when he's definitely been damned. And that's straight out of Milton, when the curse that Milton gives to Satan is feeling the pain and the torment when he is successful, even with the deep desire to do so.
And he doesn't want to pray, remember?
Right?
He's against it completely.
Let's keep in mind that this work isn't coming out of a bubble. I mean, out of a vacuum. There's a whole bunch of stuff around this time, 100 years before and after, that's staying in that Gothic. You know,
correct.
This is the same time Edgar Allan Poe's writing, so a little bit before
Poe.
But not a lot before Poe. Slightly, we have Frankenstein coming out 6 years before this came. I'm not saying Hogg read any of this stuff, but he's not the only one writing this kind of eerie, weird religious stuff. Hawthorne in America is writing like
after
like
Hogg, too.
Young Goodman Brown and things like that. You know, and these things where they have these twisted religious beliefs and the devil showing up and these things are happening. So it's not isolated here, but I'm not saying it takes anything away from the book.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that Hogg was actually reading widely these other people.
Well, remember that many of what you were talking about is the Gothic and the horror kind of that are much more genre specific,
but still psychological.
Correct.
Yeah.
But those all are often rooted in mythologies, and Scotland is a land rife with mythologies, and many of those devil's intrusions and being possessed, these are part of the local legend that have existed in that part of the world for millennia. So he's building on older things in the stories that his mother collected when he was a child, that he grew up around, and bringing this to a modern, more literary audience as opposed to the other way around.
There's even that really long, drawn-out section where one of the local women is telling this
the story
about,
within.
Exactly.
about witches or whatever it is. Yeah.
I'm so curious about like the experience of the book, because I definitely experienced it most consistently as comedy, and thought there were like quite a few parts that were. I'm even looking and this is later kind of in the really macabre section when he's having his blackouts, and there was I wrote an annotation because I laughed out loud at a moment when Robert can't remember something and then says something along the lines of like, my friend said it happened and I can rely implicitly on him. And I thought it was laugh out loud funny that Robert is standing here being like, my demon friend said that the thing is true, so it's obviously true. So I found it to be comedy mostly for me personally.
He's a Russian ruler.
Yeah.
He's a potentate.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
right. He is at one point. Doesn't Robert think he is the Tsar of Russia?
The Tsar of Russia. That's what
I
he
think
thinks.
he believes
Lucid
it
in hiding at the time. Or
almost the whole time.
Yeah.
Until the end, when it seems like even Robert recognizes, I think, right? Don't you think right at the end, Robert seems to know this is a demonic
sort
thing.
of the MAGA crowd.
Well, but
they kind of know, but they can't admit
like you
it.
only really on your deathbed will kind of. Yeah.
Well, and Scott, you might be. There is a strong parallel here because for a long time, people like the Tsar of Russia and Napoleon and other like major leaders were considered, going back to like the Roman tradition, of almost demigods. They were almost
the
like
divine right of kings.
Yeah, they had like some divinity to them, to the point that there's a scene in War and Peace where Napoleon is meeting Tsar, I think it's Nicholas I, on the battlefield, and the two of them are face to face on the battlefield. Their closest bodyguards and people are around them, and from a modern perspective, as you're reading that scene, the first thing I keep on thinking is, well, why doesn't somebody just kill Napoleon?
Yeah, he's right there.
He's right there.
Just get him.
Everybody has weapons, because that would be like killing almost like a god.
Yeah.
Like they had so much. They saw these people as so elevated above themselves that you couldn't even bring yourself to kill one of these people. And so I think same thing's going on with Gil Martin here. Like he's become this figure to Robert, that Robert just respects him so much that he couldn't possibly be leading him astray.
But he's also convinced Robert that he is one of those people himself.
Right.
Yeah, that's the danger.
Well, but I'm referring more to like, by the end, Robert like dreads his presence, right?
He
dreads
still
his
calls
presence.
him his friend,
Yeah.
though,
He
the whole
does.
time, which I think is strange.
But I'm thinking of for me, it's page 156 when he does the longest and most eloquent like plea to like leave me the F alone, is when Robert is just begging him in terms of flattery. Surely you have more important things to do. Like, please don't linger here, right? So I think by the end, it has shifted from something more. It still is like that deep respect, and that I think that like godlike idolatry. But I think by the end, he has a dread and thinks that he desperately wants to die, or wants Gil Martin to die, or wants never to see Gil Martin again. So like, I guess what happens in like in that portion between all he wants is to be with his coveted friend and do his bidding, to like, I want to die before I have to see that guy again.
I mean, it's no way was Hogg anticipating this, but couldn't we read this as the beginnings of addiction? He's in first kind of infatuated by this drug or whatever it is that he's becoming addicted to, and eventually he dreads that he's addicted to it. He can't get off it. He can't get away from it. But there's this addiction that is controlling his life.
Yeah.
It's sickening. He despises it, but he can't help it.
It's causing ruin to him and everybody around him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I also see, he's gotten this this tenet of Calvinism that is initially really comforting to him, but as it's taken more and more to an extreme degree, he has a lot of doubts that it's going to hold up.
Oh
And
gosh,
so,
yeah.
Yeah,
Gil Martin has to talk him back from it several times.
Constantly.
But Kevin, I think that what you're picking up at the end, I think, was actually there the entire time.
Yeah.
Like, even after the first meeting with him, he came back and his mother and Reverend Father said he's changed. He's been turned. Like there's something wrong, and he committed to never see that man again. And then
It was
hung out with him
unsettling
the
from
next day.
from the first, yeah.
So he kept showing up in his life, And when he was physically present with him, he got a lot of comfort, a lot of reinforcement. He convinced him of everything he wanted to be convinced of. But the minute he wasn't with him, he never wanted to see him again. I think that was pretty consistent from the
like
very first meeting.
The educator in me is just thinking of toxic high school relationships. It sounds just identical to like, no, don't be with that person. They're horrible for you. They make you horrible, but you can't help it.
All right,
quiz.
everyone, ready for a quiz?
Yes.
All right.
I'm ready.
Well, we should point out first of all that this is a new one for us because Scott has come up with the quiz this week.
Yeah,
Or
it's
this
the first
episode.
non-Joe quiz. Obviously, to no one's great surprise, I'm an Albophile, so this is digging into Scotland, but also it kind of draws it back through a line of the questions to the book and some of the context behind, which will allow us to learn a little bit, which is kind of the point. All right, guys. So the action of the story moves between several locations and cities in Scotland. Which is the nation's most populous city? Multiple choice. Is it A, Aberdeen, B, Edinburgh, C, Glasgow, or D, Inverness?
It's gotta be Glasgow.
I go with
I'm going Glasgow as well.
It is Glasgow. Yes, Glasgow is the largest. It's
1 point for Joe.
bigger than Edinburgh. Glasgow is just over 1 million people. The entire country has about 5.5 million people, but the Scottish diaspora is estimated between 28 and 40 million people. So there are more Scots living outside of Scotland based on history, leaving the country, many forced out.
Okay, 1 point Joe, 1 point Wes, no points Kevin.
Which is odd because he was the first one to answer that question. And then the sheep, Scotland reference.
The national animal, sheep.
The sheep just followed Kevin.
So we've mentioned Robert Burns. He is the Scottish national poet. Which of the following works did he directly influence? Of Mice and Men by Steinbeck, The Catcher in the Rye by Salinger, Red, Red Rose by Bob Dylan, or Auld Lang Syne sung the world over at New Year's?
Well, I know the answer to this, but if I say it, then Kevin will take credit for it. But
I'm going with
anyway.
Dylan.
Yeah.
That's definitely Catcher in the Rye. No, yeah, it's Catcher in the Rye because that's why Holden wants to catch the children who are falling off from the cliff in the rye field. That's a Robert Burns poem.
It's actually a trick question. It's all of the above.
Ah.
The title of Mice and Men, title Catcher in the Rye. Red, Red Rose is Bob Dylan credited that song as being the most influential work on all of his songwriting. And Auld Lang Syne Burns wrote, which everyone sings everywhere in the world at New Year's.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, trick question.
Trick question.
But again, 1 point for Joe. Now 2 for me, 2 for Wes. Kevin with 0.
It's just his need to be superior
now
is
that Joe didn't
embarrassing.
write the quiz, he can take credit and
I know
deny
he's really
Kevin.
relishing a new role here.
Exactly,
isn't
right?
he? Yeah.
I think next time Wes might have to write the quiz, right?
Yeah. Joe will continue to be the scorekeeper, though, of course.
Yeah, obviously.
Thank you.
He's as trustworthy as Gil Martin, I might venture to say.
All right. So Robert Burns wrote about a famous battle of Bannockburn, which took place in 1314, which was the first big moment of Scottish independence, where a great Scottish leader defeated the English and won their freedom. Was this leader A, Robert the Bruce, B, Andrew Moray, C, William Wallace, or D, James Stewart?
I feel like, I don't know if you're trying to mislead us, that you read the question as William Wallace, basically, I feel. I feel like you leaned into William Wallace. I'm just going to go William Wallace.
Did I say William Wallace?
No, it was like an attitude.
Oh, okay.
A tone.
Okay.
I'm going William Wallace.
Who was the first guy?
Robert the Bruce.
I'm going Robert the Bruce.
Yeah, I'm going with I have no idea.
All right. It was, in fact, Wes. Robert the
All
Bruce.
right.
Which, if you saw the film Braveheart, that was the culmination, the final scene. William Wallace died like 15 or 20 years before that battle took place.
Right. It's like the setup.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And Andrew Moray and William Wallace sort of started that whole war, if you will, and Robert the Bruce finished it.
Nice. All right.
James Stewart was actually Robert the Bruce's, I think, grandson, and became James Stewart the First, James the First of Scotland. And that line of kings continued for generations, culminating in the reign of James the Sixth of Scotland. What was James the Sixth of Scotland also known as? Was it James of Gutenberg, James the First, James of Orange, or James the Peach that might have been giant?
That last one really rings a
feels
bell.
Unlikely.
So no James the Great. They didn't go there in Scotland. They didn't call them.
There was
They weren't great and terrible.
I'm going to say James the First.
Yeah, I like James the First. It seems oddly ironic.
Yeah, there was a William of Orange, wasn't there? I don't think it's. I think
Duke of Normandy.
James the First. A or B, it seems.
It was James. So James, when Elizabeth I died, James the Sixth of Scotland, because I believe James IV married Henry VIII's sister, Margaret Tudor. So he was the next in line for the throne and became James I of England. So the same James I that Shakespeare wrote Macbeth for, the same King James Bible was published for, was actually first the King of Scotland.
All right, I learned something.
Yeah,
Learned something.
didn't know.
The English don't like to admit that. But then they killed his several generations, Charles I, later. All right. So back to the timeline of the novel. In the book, we see rival political factions that only a few years after the events of the book take place culminate in the first of several bloody confrontations, principally in 1715 and 1745. These were famously known as the Calvinist Reformation, the Highland Clearances, the Covenanters' Glorious Revolution, or the Jacobite Rebellion.
I'm going Jacobite Rebellion on that one.
Yeah, it's got to be D, right?
Yeah, it seems right to me.
Yes, and that, as we mentioned earlier, there might just be a question about that. So if you've
right,
seen the Outlander series, have you guys seen those?
I haven't. I've seen it. I keep thinking about watching it, but that's the time period.
Yeah, and that's basically they executed Charles I, who was the king of the joint kingdoms, and his progeny a few generations later were in exile, and there was a movement to bring them back as Scottish kings. Really, if you talk to people in Scotland, it was less about who is the royal party. It was more about independence. It was about Scotland saying, no, we are kind of our own country and should be able to do our own thing.
Did Cromwell execute Charles I?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, mid-1600s, I believe. All right, back to James Hogg. James Hogg worked on a project directly with which contemporary great? Sir Walter Scott, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, or Mary Shelley?
I know because I did the research on this, so I'll let you two guess first.
I think it's Mary Shelley. I think there was something in the introduction about it. I could be misremembering, though.
I'll be different and say Walter Scott.
It is definitely Walter Scott.
It is. He knew William Wordsworth and met him on a few occasions, but Scott recruited him to help fill in stories for the Scots Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, which were a bunch of tales, folklore that he compiled and put into a literary work.
Is Walter?
In fact, that's why he initially gets into the writing community.
Exactly right.
That's his first introduction into the writing community.
I think it was like his brother-in-law knew him, or there was some weird connection there.
Maybe. I don't know about that part.
Do either of you know, is Walter Scott the one, once Hogg met him and got to know him, then that relationship became very fractured? Is that Walter Scott, or do you?
Well, you mentioned Wordsworth is the person I said in the biography that wrote kind of a nice eulogy, kind of final words about Hogg, but then in to his friends he kind of stabbed him in the back, right?
I'm trying to remember what I read something in
Sort
the
of
intro
like
about
Ringham did.
A little bit like her.
Yeah.
And Kevin, just because we'll get to this a little bit later, I thought there's lots to talk about between the parallels between Frankenstein and this novel. But there's no evidence that Hogg even read Frankenstein or in any way was inspired by it, even though it was published about 6 years before this novel was published.
Oh, I was just gonna say I don't even know if they were
Wasn't
contemporaries.
Frankenstein originally published anonymously?
I don't
Honestly,
know
but I might
that. You might be right. I mean, I only know I've taught it several times, and I don't recall ever seeing that. She was just a girl. She was only 18 years old when she wrote it, and she wrote it in, I don't know if this is good,
In
down
the
the rabbit
castle
hole.
with Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Yeah,
and
all
whatever.
all the British romantic poets were all
Holed up and,
using opium, and
yeah.
they all stayed around. And they decided who could tell the scariest ghost
Yep.
story, and this was the only thing that kind of
Clearly she won.
and she won.
All right, so Kevin, you mentioned sheep earlier,
Oh, yeah.
but what is the official national animal of Scotland? Is it the black bull of Norway? Is it Nessie, a.k.a. the Loch Ness Monster? Is it the unicorn? Or is it the haggis?
haggis is a food, isn't it?
It
Well,
is a
but
food,
we often eat animals.
maybe an
like,
animal too.
Chicken.
Maybe
is
you
a,
do.
Chicken is a food.
I'm gonna go haggis simply because it is so unusual.
And it's so Scottish, but
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
going with Nessie.
Nessie.
Well-
I'll go, be different. I'll go with the unicorn.
There you go. Kevin won.
Yes.
Nice.
Of course he did.
Everyone else knows. So the unicorn has been used in sigilry for Scotland for centuries and is officially the animal. The haggis is more of a sausage. It's not actually an animal, but there's like a
too
line
bad.
of funny memes like
I was
pretending
going
it's
to say,
an
I
animal.
didn't think
Yeah.
it was an actual animal. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then Nessie, of course, everyone knows. But funnily enough, do you guys remember the inn where they were celebrating? Was the Black Bull of Norway. And the Black Bull of Norway is a famous Scottish myth. So it was a reference to some of those lowland mythologies that he had helped collect.
All right. Hog.
Hog, there you go. What science fiction?
This quiz just keeps on going. That's
Keeps going. There are only 3 more questions.
And Joe, will it break
I
your heart
mean-
to know they always feel this long?
I do know the score. Wes is at 7.
Okay.
I'm at 6. Kevin's at -2.
Okay, that's so weird how I ended up there.
So, what science fiction dystopian writer created a modern version of this work? Was it George Orwell, Anthony Burgess, Ray Bradbury, or Aldous Huxley?
I'm going with Bradbury.
Well, I feel like we should know this.
Well, I don't believe it's Orwell or Huxley because I feel like I know most of their works. And the other person you said was
Anthony Burgess.
Burgess.
Famous for
Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, I don't know his work as well.
I'll say Burgess. I could see this being like a
Yeah,
lesser work of his.
That's where I'm leaning as well.
Unless you're suggesting that one of the majors is a remake.
Well, Joe, you are wrong, and Kevin and Wes are correct.
That must hurt.
He wrote an entire trilogy called the Enderby Trilogy.
Okay.
I have
About
heard
a
of
man
that, yeah.
who actually
Wow.
is referential to this character.
Huh.
And oddly enough, I've read that.
Oh, you have?
And I did not know it was connected to this book in any way, shape, or form.
Well, there you go. All right. So we mentioned also that maybe I was my ancestor.
The odd person in the room.
But James Hogg is actually a direct ancestor of a Nobel Prize winning author. Is it Sinclair Lewis, Alice Munro, Seamus Heaney, or Doris Lessing?
And I know this one too, so I'll wait for you guys to guess on this one.
I mean, the obvious answer is Seamus Heaney, right?
Yeah, although he's Irish, not Scottish, isn't he? But or am I wrong?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think Haney. I think he is Irish, but that doesn't mean that he can't have a Scottish ancestor.
Okay, so point for Joe, Alice Munro.
Oh, isn't she
Alice
Canadian?
Munro is Canadian.
You can be Canadian and have Scottish
But
ancestors.
remember,
Yeah,
many
yeah.
Scots fled Scotland in the 1700s.
Oh, wait.
I mean-
Monroe's mentioned in the now.
Yeah.
Yes, Monroe's
And
mentioned.
My daughter is actually named Monroe, who came down and visited us a few minutes ago. After all the mountains in Scotland over 3,000 feet. But that's how you spell
Nice.
her name and a
Interesting.
proper Scottish name.
I would-
Munro.
Not even my second guess.
Hogs Raised in the Country
All right.
News that Canadian writer Alice Munro is a collateral descendant. She
Yeah.
was born Alice Laidlaw, and is the blood of his grandfather Will of Yeah, I think there's a thing
Yeah,
where
so-
she was asked about it,
Mm.
and I'm not gonna.
Yeah, so
dig
Kevin,
for
what
it.
you also forgot to think about is, it's not Monroe might not be her maiden name.
Sure.
I mean, clearly it's not from that introduction.
Yeah, Laidlaw. Scottish.
All right. So, after the great success of the Melania documentary, Amazon Studios have announced their intent to produce a modern adaptation of Confessions. Who has been pegged to play the role of Robert Ringham Colvin? Is it A, Stephen Miller? So I just hogtied you. I completely set you up in the same way that James Hogg would have, because that is not true at all. But I planted a seed much in the way that he wrote an article
We've been hogtied.
a year before publication alleging this grave was actually found. And then he used that as a marketing piece to try to sell his book.
Are you cranking my hog right now?
Yeah, yes, I am. And
Wait,
I think
Stephen Miller, not the actor, but the Trump,
the Trump lackey.
yeah, okay.
Who would be the perfect person
who
to
might,
play
in fact,
Robert Ringham.
succeed.
Yes.
Yeah, at that role. Wow, that quiz was a ride.
It's a good one. Yeah.
So, and it leads me into one of the things I want to talk about, which is the number of occurrences past this book where writers insert themselves into the story, because Hogg makes an appearance in this book. And as you said, he also wrote an article a year before the book was published, kind of to add to the credibility of the book. Vonnegut comes to mind immediately. Vonnegut, of course, wrote several.
Slaughterhouse-Five.
Yeah, he appears as a character in Slaughterhouse-Five and in Breakfast of Champions, but he also creates a character named Kilgore Trout, who's a writer who shows up in a couple of his novels, namely Breakfast of Champions and a couple others. I think he might be in Slaughterhouse-Five.
He's mentioned in Slaughterhouse-Five,
Yeah.
but also Chapter 1 of Slaughterhouse-Five is Vonnegut, so that's a weird one. I think they're both present.
But there's a moment in Slaughterhouse-Five where they're like in a POW camp, and he says, "Isn't that guy over there with the ill-fitting? That was me."
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So like he actually inserts himself,
Yeah.
and in Kilgore Trout, you guys probably know this. I feel like we've talked about this. Vonnegut published 3 or 4 really bad, like dime store paperback novels under the pen name Kilgore Trout, and it says nothing in the novel that it's written by Vonnegut. And they're kind of like now collector's items if you can find them. It used to be something when you went around and used bookstores, you'd always try to look for them, but now you can find them on Amazon and on like, eBay and things like that. But it used to be like, looking for buried treasure to see if you can find a Kilgore Trout novel. And it was kind of this inside joke you had. So Vonnegut was really good at doing that. And I was wondering, like, if you can think of other people who have done that, like kind of inserted themselves in.
Arno Schmidt does it.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah.
The only other thing I could find is Tim O'Brien makes an appearance in the short story The Things They Carry.
Yeah, he does. That's true.
The greatest Scottish writer of the 20th century, Alistair Gray, in Lanark: A Life in 4 Books, does the same thing, where he has a very metafiction chapter toward, I think in book 3 or beginning of book 4, where the author actually has a direct conversation with the main character.
Okay, so he's actually talking to his characters. So he's actually assuming a role as a character in the book.
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of it's very much, and there are many elements of this book that are postmodern by today's standards, and that's one of them, right? This idea that he does put himself in the novel.
Yeah.
Does Joyce ever do it?
I don't know.
I can't think of an occasion, but I could be missing.
And the funny thing about in this book too is like Hogg is in there for maybe a few sentences, and he's speaking in this incredibly thick and hard to understand Scottish brogue, talking about the cattle he has to attend to, and wants nothing to do with the scholars who are trying to find the body.
Right.
But
that was
it's
funny.
enough to jar the reader who's paying attention.
Yes.
Like, oh wait, what just happened? And I'm wondering what you think. What you think that adds to a work to put when the writer puts himself in? Is it just playfulness, or is there something else going on here?
I guess I wonder with this one if it has anything to do with the fact that he did publish quote unquote anonymously, right? He's putting his signature to it in a pretty obvious way.
Yeah.
Outside of that, I guess I'm not sure. What do you guys think?
Yeah, my general inclination is it just feels like a party trick, right? But But I do think that's compelling. The other one I was trying to think of is whether I could remember Oscar Wilde ever doing it, because I think by similar arguments sometimes
Playful.
Yeah, when you have like or where content is objectionable and you're trying to but I don't know verifiably whether he did. So
Well, and a lot of this content was not good at the time.
yeah,
So a lot of
objectionable.
people felt it objectionable, felt it coarse, felt it broad. So to distance himself from that,
But to still hide yourself in it
Still hide
somewhere.
yourself in
Yeah,
it
I
somewhere.
kind of think that's
Yeah.
Well, and I read too that even like the woman at the beginning of the novel, Ringham's mom, she was based on a person who was pretty well known at the time, and he even uses her actual name in the first few pages of the book. So yeah, I see why he might have wanted to go the anonymous route.
Yeah. So to move it on to my next point here, another thing that I think Hogg does really well, and there are other writers who do this as well, and that is they almost define psychology before psychology becomes a thing. And I mean, you mentioned that this might be one of the early ideas of schizophrenia. And there's the split personality in here. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is another split personality book. We see fictional writers creating characters who are suffering with mental illness. Shakespeare does it, you know, and before there's actual psychology that's actually treating mental illness in a serious way, like we hopefully are doing today. So I was thinking, like, you know, you have stories like Edgar Allan Poe, who I mentioned earlier, Telltale's Heart, where this guy's like going into this heartbeat. He's starting to hear the heartbeat under the floor. It's this descent into madness. Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. And then there's this short story by Charlotte Perkin Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper, which is often taught in school. Yeah. I'm wondering if you guys can think of other books that like kind of really dive into psychology of the human being before like we actually have real psychology out there.
Well, the classic is, you know, Hamlet is like a textbook, just depression and suicidal ideation, all the kind of things we don't have terms
elector
for.
complexes. And,
and he has some. Remind me in Hamlet. There's something going on with his mother and his attraction to his mother,
Gertrude.
Right? His defense of her honor after his father's
Methinks
murder.
the lady doth protest too much.
All right. Is Yellow Wallpaper? I forget, is it like postpartum or is it just like full?
So that was the idea behind it, and it was also making fun of this. It was a very popular medical cure at the time to have women believe that they were overexcitable, and so the best way to
hysterical.
The best way to treat them was to put them in a place where they had no stimulation at all. Yeah. So just lay in a bed, in a room, in a bed, and do nothing. Don't write, don't read, nothing, because anything's going to overstimulate them.
The term hysterical comes from the same term as hysterectomy.
Yeah.
It's from the womb, so it's only classically applicable to women and completely misogynistic and ridiculous.
So,
I don't know. It sounds reasonable.
Oh boy.
So I mean, not to get too far down the rabbit hole, but Perkins Gilman was a feminist of her day, and she was writing this story directly in opposition to this doctor recommended cure that all these women were being forced to do. Even in the story, her husband is a doctor who's making her in like basically locking her in a room, and she just goes gradually insane by staring at the wallpaper.
Creeping around in circles.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of The Awakening too. But
I mean, you can go back to Greek mythology.
Right.
Look back at
Oedipus, that's what I was thinking
Look back
of,
at all of these characters that are just strongly tied to human psychological
understanding human
conditions.
psychology, right? And then of course Freud comes along and other people come along, and Freud's the first person who is really trying to like kind of make these direct connections with mythology and human psychology. And today, by many accounts, the Freudian stuff is considered to be outdated and not really, you know, something that anybody can demonstrate through scientific method. But it was a start. It was a start at trying to see people as actual complex beings who weren't possessed by the devil when they were having mental illness, right?
And also at tying significance and importance to things we might not otherwise see.
Yeah.
Right? It's that there is this concept of, so that's the element of Freud that is still valid, is the concept of subconscious things that we can do and say things that really we know we're doing and saying, which I would say this character is doing that, but he can't consciously admit that to the world or to his own consciousness, or else he'll just go crazy.
Yeah,
it's cognitive dissonance.
Right, the idea of repression
Yeah.
and denial, right, and not in blind spots and all that kind of stuff. I mean, the one thing that I think is very prevalent in Catcher in the Rye is the idea of projection, where everything Holden says is basically he's saying he's identifying himself.
Yeah.
When he's calling everybody phony, he's actually saying exactly what he thinks about himself.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't in your first book, Joe, isn't there a moment when you enter the scene?
Yeah, the book that'll be coming out in a couple months,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I'm in that. Well, not me personally, but the
author.
narrator is in the book, right? The author doesn't understand why.
It's been a couple years since I've read that manuscript, but I remember.
But he
that
doesn't
metafiction
appear. He
moment.
doesn't appear in the narrative itself.
Okay.
He appears as the writer of the book in therapy,
That's right.
talking about the book he's writing.
Yeah.
Right.
Going back to Freud for a second, I do agree that like a lot of what he said has not completely held up over the years, but I did read The Interpretation of Dreams by Freud, and I've got to be honest, I feel like a lot of that still holds up. When I was reading it, I felt like I was remembering more of my dreams, probably because I was reading the book about it, and his whole idea, not to go too much down the rabbit hole, but he talks about dreams as being wish fulfillment, even when they don't seem like they possibly could be. And it actually makes a lot of sense. So interesting stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And I've often thought that about, people who are deeply immersed in literature and reading, we're studying human behavior. And a lot of these authors are incredibly good at understanding human behavior and creating realistic characters who do realistic things. And in order to do that, even on a television show, a movie, or in a novel, you have to understand human tendencies and human behaviors and motivations.
You have to be a student of it. Yeah.
And it's funny because prior to Freud, and prior to Joseph Campbell, for example, like writers were writing the hero quest for millennia.
Right.
And because they just sort of intuitively figured it out, writers were writing real humans with psychological depth. It wasn't until later that we were given the tools to kind of clinically break those down. It doesn't mean those things didn't exist.
Yeah.
Right. They were observant, I think.
Correct. And now it's almost like people can take it as a paint by numbers. Oh, so George Lucas can pick up a copy of The Hero's Journey and make Star Wars following this blueprint, and
then Harry Potter can do the same thing.
Or, you can there are all these like, oh, come up for a writer's workshop and we'll teach you the psychological breakdown and how to craft your memorable characters. It's like a paint by numbers. This character should fit this profile and these are the characteristics. Whereas people just understood
naturally,
humans
authentically,
naturally.
Well, and maybe Scott, that's where we'll get when we have competing AI written novels and human written novels. AI written stories are going to be by nature formulaic, and will they have the ability to suck us in and develop characters that we really care about? Will they understand that really subtle thing about being a human? And if they can, then maybe that's a scary thing. Maybe it's an awesome thing. I don't know. I'm skeptical that they can do it, and I think we'll always be an audience for human produced art.
Yeah, that's a good.
I'm with you.
I guess we'll see, but I like the way I just immediately thought of Jonathan Franzen, like just as a contemporary when you're talking about someone who's just sort of naturally attuned to like all the weird darknesses bouncing around in the heads of human beings versus like in a really authentic way versus someone who's just clearly trying to reproduce like a narrative arc. But
you can teach tricks and tropes and things like that, but you're not going to have the authenticity that you have with the real artists.
And that's to that point, I think that what has caused a lot of things to endure is a uniqueness to the voice and the style, and AI I think it would be hard for AI to generate that because it's working off of existing things, right? So is it going to have that unique voice?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I would be doubtful.
Well, and I've often thought fiction's a really, really strange thing because we invest and care about and deeply feel like we know characters who don't exist. For example, we're spending an hour and a half, 2 hours talking about characters that have never lived. These characters are completely made up by Hogg. And yet we treat them as if they're real people, and we talk about them like they're real people. And that's like the magic of fiction. Jay Gatsby seems like a real person who actually lived.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny you say. I was literally just getting ready to say, like, back to the book, that one thing I really appreciate about what Hogg has done is he's made Robert's like duality feel very relatable, in the sense of you can do the deep reading of like, well, the double is the devil, but you can do a reading of this book where it's like, no, that's just all stuff that lives within one human being, and
repressed stuff.
That's like
dark demons.
We all have a version of that. That's like the strange urges of the thoughts that you don't share publicly and the things. And I really appreciate that about that Robert, though he's absurd. There's an element of Robert's duality that feels very like, that's kind of what it is to be a human being. It is to feel all those things at once and sort of not know always what to do with it.
Maybe for you, Kevin, that sounds kind of dark. I don't know.
Oh no. This is the moment when you're all supposed to be like, yeah, definitely. For sure.
Well, let's move on to another thing I want to talk about here, which is the idea of the found manuscript. With an editor introducing the document, offering background based on hearsay and local accounts, and then presenting the manuscript itself. This is not new to Hogg. I mean, Don Quixote is this. Don Quixote is a found manuscript. It's actually written in Arabic. And the person who's presenting Don Quixote to us has gotten the manuscript translated into English.
Yep.
And actually, interestingly, in Don Quixote, there's a whole like 10 or 12 pages that open the novel that are praise about the novel, like these paragraphs like this, and they're all fictional. They're all made up by Cervantes also to make it seem like people have praised this novel before they did. And then I thought, obviously, A Scarlet Letter is the same way. The Scarlet Letter, historically, I don't know if you guys know the story or not, but Hawthorne wrote The Scarlet Letter, and the publisher said it's too short. And so he wrote The Custom House, which is like the first 40 pages of the novel, which is this backstory of how the manuscript came to be found in a customs house. And it has nothing to do with the actual novel, but it makes the found manuscript idea. And then I haven't read Handmaid's Tale, but apparently the Handmaid's Tale is also a found manuscript in the sense that it's a series of cassette recordings that had been transcribed by historians and then presented to the reader sometime into the future.
Which, for any cinephiles out there, that's also the premise of one of this year's Best Picture and International Feature nominees, The Secret Agent. Oh. It's the premise of it is it's a found series of cassette tapes of interviews. So it's the same idea.
And then I was also thinking of the Blair Witch Project, which might be a little bit before your time, but that was like the beginning of videotapes, and somebody finds this videotape in the woods.
And that is exactly what I was actually going to mention that is what James Hogg did here. Yeah. Where he made this thing and he published an article about this found body in anticipation of publishing this book.
Right. So obviously it lends a sense that this is real. This actually is this is a true document. But I'm wondering how you guys think about the found document kind of trope.
And I think we have to separate chronology here too, to a degree, because Umberto Eco did the same thing in Name of the Rose, a more contemporary writer, right?
Right. I forgot about that one.
And Margaret Atwood, certainly, they know what they're doing, and they're doing that for literary effect. There is a point, though, when Hogg is writing, and when other writers in that pre-Victorian era, pre-modern era, translation was seen as the epitome of scholarship. acting and creative writing was seen as lesser than, by and large. Novels were not something really to be celebrated, right? It was trash. It was sitcom television. It was commercials. And people would often make up an original source that they're simply compiling and editing to give it some scholarly credence. And the concept of originality as being a good thing in art is a very modern invention that only really happened with modernism and postmodernism. When everything is a copy of a copy, originality is sought after that. Before that, conformity is what was.
So it was a utilitarian choice for some of in centuries past, whereas it's clearly just a style choice now.
Yeah, that makes me think of, there was a this was also in Johnson's time. Read about this in his book. I believe it was in Scotland. There was some poetry supposedly by this ancient character Ossian. And it was completely, completely
from the 3rd century, right? Completely made up.
Completely made up. And so they found these manuscripts, right? And they're translating it so that people can continue to read.
Then produce forgeries when asked to produce the manuscripts.
Produce forgeries. And Johnson was talking, he's talking about wanting to see the originals for Ossian, and he never could see them.
Yep. Right. There was, I remember,
and now we know why.
We know why.
Another work I read at the University of Edinburgh was a work by Robert Henderson, and it's The Testament of Cressida. So Shakespeare wrote Troilus and Cressida. Chaucer wrote the version. It was a story from the Iliad about lovers on both sides of the wall, so to speak. And he wrote this beautiful poem. I want to say the 1400s, probably something to look up. It was after Chaucer, but in this era where, in order to have it be accepted, he had to lie and say he found this in Chaucer's works, and I'm simply cleaning it up and putting it to a new verse. But it was a completely original story of the two of them years later meeting and passing on the road when she was dressed up as like a nun and he couldn't see her. He had leprosy. She didn't recognize him, and they passed, but then realized that they had just passed the loves of their life further down the road, and it was the tragedy all over again. It was this amazing story that he literally had to lie and deny ownership of to have it be accepted at the time.
Well, I guess that makes, then you wonder, okay, so to do it as a modern writer, then is it a bit gimmicky? And I think probably that comes down to the skill of the writer, because Margaret Atwood can do it. I mean, I just read.
I mean, Blair Witch, when it came out in '99, it created a sense of authenticity that felt, because there was nothing, the studio, the producers, nobody released anything saying, oh yeah, this isn't real. Like they just left it up to the audience, and it was plausible enough. Oh, we found this video camera in the woods.
It was quickly sussed out as being that. Right. But if you had gone into a theater thinking, oh, this was just found footage that these college kids spliced together.
I remember when it came out, but I don't remember anyone actually believing that. Well, but it was like the mythos.
Well, when it got big, no one believed it by that point. But if you were part of those original first few crowds,
maybe you're right. Yeah, when it was small, and
I think even now that found footage horror movies are kind of a known thing, a little bit of a trope. They can still work really well if it's a good director.
That's what I mean. Right? I think when it's skillfully done,
it can still be done well and still add to the scariness.
Like, I don't want to hate on Frederick Bachman if anybody loves Beartown but I just read his newest book, and it does a bit of a found thing at the end, and it felt really cheesy. But I don't remember feeling that way about The Handmaid's Tale. I remember thinking like, oh, that's kind of a cool idea.
Okay, so a concept that just popped in my head too is, if you take this found document to then create it actually automatically builds in a layer of unreliability of narration.
Exactly.
Because the current author takes no claim that this is their actual opinion and work. This is just something they found. And so it adds that layer of intrigue that otherwise you're kind of putting a force of narrative and authenticity behind something.
Which is what I did in both of my novels. In both of my novels, I create a layer between me and the work by creating another person who's actually telling the story. So in the novel that'll be released in the future, as you mentioned, the author of the novel actually is a character in the book. So I am only then the author who's writing the novel. I'm not actually so you can't read any psychology into what the character's actually going through. Oh, well, that must be something that Hecker's going through.
Joe,
so
sometimes
it's like
a cigar is just a cigar.
Right, exactly. So it's a way to like remove yourself from the work and kind of insulate yourself and say there's no psychological reading here. You can't because I've removed myself further back, and it's a found manuscript.
Yeah.
But I think there's also the idea that in some cases you have to explain to the reader how this story came into publication, right? How did it happen that now you're reading it? Mm-hmm. And I think in a third person narration, like a Dickens or something like that, there's just assume that, okay, you're fine with it. There's this omniscient narrator who's just presenting the story.
You suspend disbelief. You just accept
it feels like it's almost like you want to like give the reader a little bit more so they don't have to suspend their disbelief. Like in Moby Dick, Ishmael has to survive so he can tell the story. If everybody dies, then nobody can tell the story.
Right.
So Ishmael is the only person who survives the shipwreck at the end.
Which is always that like bad TV premise of like, you have to leave to tell the story,
Right. Somebody has to be alive to tell the story. And, The Sopranos, the famous ending of The Sopranos. So all of a sudden, what point of view is this story in?
Yeah.
And I'm assuming we're far enough away from the famous ending of that we can say that, when Tony gets shot in that last scene, or we assume he's shot, we don't know. Everything just goes black.
Don't stop.
Yeah,
right.
It's basically his perspective that we're following, and his perspective ends at that moment.
I think too the fact that Hogg actually published this article in Blackwoods, he is really committed to this bit.
To the bit,
right?
Yep.
I think that so many of these, found footage or whatever the literary equivalent term is. It's almost an afterthought, but he was planning this.
Well, and I think that there's absolutely with him, and Dickens was the master of marketing. He was a better marketer than he was a writer. And Hogg this is his attempt. I mean, he was struggling financially, as Joe mentioned. Like, he was trying to gain some attention with a magazine that had an audience. And so he was trying to build this idea of, oh, this is kind of cool. This is a real thing. I want to read more about this through this article. So it was absolutely marketing, but kind of a gimmick, but kind of fun and metadramatic and very postmodern also.
Yeah.
And you wonder what was going through his mind at the time.
I've read a lot of literature from the 1700s, and I have absolutely heard of Blackwoods before.
Yeah.
So, it's
cool.
And
it's interesting what you said, Scott, that we have the whole era from ancient Greece. We're talking Western world, of course. Yeah. So ancient Greece through the Christian era, where there was no fiction. Everything was meant to be a lesson. And whether it's pre-Christian, the Greek stories were always trying to teach something, trying to create an idea of what's a value we want you to kind of embrace. And then Christianity comes along, and like it becomes the only thing that you can write about is something that's increasing, the spirituality or the moral Christian message. Otherwise, it's just kind of sinful. Yeah. And so there's no fiction until Shakespeare and Cervantes come along. And they do have to start. You're right. They have to start. Like, Shakespeare doesn't necessarily have to. He's writing theater, but he's not writing religious theater. He's writing secular theater. Yeah. Some of it's historical in a way. And then, but I like the idea that those people earlier, they had to almost like say, well, no, I didn't make this up. It was, there's a historical document I found. So I'm just telling you like history, right?
Yeah.
And then at some point in maybe the 1800s, that shifts and we have a more receptive audience to fiction. So we don't have to have like a justification for why you would read fiction.
The layers aren't required anymore.
So let's move on. If you guys will humor me, I want to talk a little bit about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and and some similarities. I was immediately struck by Frankenstein. I think Joyce Carol Oates says this. She says that the reason she still teaches is there's no place else that she can enjoy the kind of rich conversation around literature as in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And she just values that.
She's
And
never been on our podcast,
Clearly
obviously.
She's not, right? That's a good point, yeah.
Or no,
And-
has she listened to it? I doubt she's one of our tens of listeners.
But
Could be.
But as a teacher, as a former teacher, and Kevin will, I think, relate to this, when you teach a book several years, you really, that book in a way that is very, very intimate, and like you're really into like the deep,
Yeah.
the deep nuances of the book, right? I mean, you kind of understand it. So I've taught Frankenstein probably 15 times.
Yeah.
And you just know the book at that point. And so as I'm reading Hogg, I started thinking about Frankenstein, and I knew that they were published around the same time. So 6 years later, as we mentioned earlier, there's no indication that Hogg was influenced by Shelley or that he read Frankenstein, but they're both British Isles. There had to be a zeitgeist there of kind of like this idea of writing about mystery, writing about kind of somewhat what we might today call Gothic or odd ideas. Interestingly, Shelley has Victor go to the Scottish Isles to build the second creature in Frankenstein, this kind of isolated, mysterious locale. And that's, of course, the same place that we find the manuscript in this book. So there's still like kind of this idea that there's this part of Scotland, and maybe, Scott, you can talk about this a little bit more, like the Highlands or the moors, where it's like this really rural, rustic, not very well populated area of Scotland, that's very kind of, that would be a great backdrop for this kind of mysterious scenes and settings.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Scotland is certainly steeped in mythology. The Highlands are this mountainous region with all these nooks and crannies and lost valleys. And
is that still true today? It's still rather
for sure,
sparsely populated.
It's a place where, like we said, there's a little over 5 million people in the country, and like 3 million of them are between Glasgow and Edinburgh, which are only there's 100 miles or so between the coasts, that connect those cities. So just all in that lowland central area,
Then when you get up
most
to the
of the
Highlands,
population lives, and then you have a few bigger towns like Aberdeen, Inverness, Fort William, Dundee, things like that. But yeah, it's just largely rural swaths of just this mystical ground that just shadows and fog, and you see the Loch Ness Monster coming out of the lake. It's crazy.
So the weather's just not the weather and the environment, the nature of that area just isn't conducive to large populations.
Absolutely. But it's funny because there's also this like supernatural tendency. And I remember very much, again, at the Uni of Edinburgh reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the professor made it a point to say that, do you know where that book is set? Where Stevenson set the book was in London. But he did that to get an audience. He did that for acceptance within the English community. It was undoubtedly set in Edinburgh. I mean, the description of the town, the physical description, was nothing to do with England.
Like
it was
he just swapped the name
absolutely
out.
Aldrich-y. He just put the name to be accepted. So there's a point of that too, where like the English will see Scotland as this wild, far-flung, Wild West kind of place, right? Whereas it has that mythology, it has that deep sense, but it is a little something different that sometimes has to be removed.
Yeah. So
I kind of like the idea that like in the metaverse somewhere, Gil Martin is just like a period of the creature's life from Frankenstein, somewhere between the cottage and the...
Well, that's good. 'Cause you can tell me if you think this is too much of a stretch. Obviously in this book we've talked about, there's like this found manuscript, and we have this the memoir of Robert himself. Well, of course, Mary Shelley had to figure out a way to tell the Frankenstein story because Victor dies and then the creature goes off and commits suicide. So who's left to tell the story? Well, the story is only told in a flashback. Victor is found floating on ice in the North Pole by Robert. I think his name is Walton, who is like this ship's captain who's trying to be famous by going to the North Pole, and he finds this guy floating around on a piece of ice who's almost dead. They pulled him on the boat. They nurse him back to health, and it turns out to be Victor Frankenstein. He says, "You won't believe all the things that have happened to me. I can't be your friend. I'm too corrupt. I'm too broken. But let me tell you why I can't be your friend." So then he goes into narrating the whole story of how he created this creature. And in that story, then Victor says, well, one time the creature made me sit in a cave, and the creature told me his story. So then Victor is relating the creature story to Walton. Walton's writing all this in a letter sending home to his sister. So we kind of have this found manuscript in a way, but you can tell me if you think that's too much of a stretch to like kind of connect it to as like kind of justifying how these stories come into existence.
I don't think. I mean, it's a core feature of Frankenstein that it's like, yeah, the letters that recorded by the captain. I don't think it's a stretch. Is it a stretch to think there might be sort of deeper thematic crossover? I don't know.
Well, let's see, because the next thing I want to talk about was Robert, we think, could be delusional. He could be possessed, or he could be self-deceiving. And Victor also kind of spirals into madness. And we don't know, as he's telling his own story, how reliable he is. And then he's the one who presents the creature story. And we don't even, now we're having the creature story not necessarily told by the creature, although the creature does speak at the very end directly to Walton. But it doesn't like retell the whole story.
Yeah.
Right.
And he's the most eloquent voice in the entire.
Yeah, he is.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, it's,
Also
Right.
true.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that the one thing that I think makes this one a little, I suppose, unique, we talk about unreliable narrators a lot, and sometimes it's probably a little bit of a stretch, right? But in this case, we know that the narrator is unreliable.
There's no narrator that's
right. We're hearing the same thing from different perspectives that can't possibly jive together. Yeah. For instance, when he talks about, the editor talks about seeing Ringham stab his brother in the back, right?
Yep.
When he's describing it, he talks about having a fight with his brother, and that eventually he prevails.
Yep.
And he's like, oh, well, actually, this is what Gil Martin told me. I don't really remember it like that, but I'm sure he's telling the truth.
Yeah, that was the part I read where I'm like, the absurdity of my demon friend said so.
But then there are dozens of examples of, for example, in that same exact scene, he clearly represents that Gil Martin presented him with two dueling rapiers that were gilded.
Mm-hmm.
But the description by the eyewitnesses were claymore, which is a massive two-handed Scottish sword.
Much bigger.
A very different weapon. That's like,
bigger.
He pulled a Glock handgun versus he had an assault rifle. It's a very different sort of thing.
Yeah.
Brings me back to RuneScape days. If anyone ever played that game online?
No.
Well, quite many years ago, although you all potentially could have played it.
There's also a contemporary Scottish Frankenstein connection with Poor Things. The Academy Award-winning film, which was based on a novel by
Alistair
Gray, mentioned already.
All right, so another parallel I want to explore and see what you think of this is both novels project an idea of a doubling.
Yeah.
So we don't know if Gil Martin is an actual person or is like kind of a split personality off of Robert. And there's a reading of Frankenstein that's pretty well known, I'm sure, but here knows that the creature doesn't really exist. He's Victor's personified homosexuality that Victor's trying to reject and deny. Yeah. And so if that's the case, then we have the same idea that neither Gil Martin nor the creature actually exist, that Victor is actually killing all these people to protect his secret that he doesn't want to admit. And Robert is just kind of justifying his killing by being possessed by this voice in his head that's telling him to do it. So I think those are pretty strong parallels. Now, of course, the other parallel that I think is hard to deny is that both novels explore a theme of a character who descends into isolation. And the further that character gets into isolation, the more distorted they become. And this is a really explored theme in Frankenstein. I think it's also present in this book as well, that Robert never seeks help. Yeah. He never seeks counsel outside of Gil. Gil's his only counsel. Victor never asks for any advice about whether he should build a creature, what he should do, how he should handle this. He's just convinced he knows the best way to handle
In
it.
fact, when people do try to intercede, he rejects them.
Yeah, and Frankenstein.
And Frankenstein,
Yeah.
right.
Well, also in this book.
Right.
Yeah, because
Oh,
his,
that's true.
his
His
mom
His
and
mother and
adoptive,
probably
yeah.
his dad,
Yeah.
you know, they're encouraging him not to spend time with Gil Martin.
Exactly.
Right. So
Yeah.
we talk about this idea of like writers having a certain psychological instinct or just kind of a basic idea of intuition around psychology. And they both seem to recognize the fact that as soon as somebody becomes very isolated and starts acting without any guidance, they're likely to become very distorted.
Yeah.
And even Don Quixote does it as well.
Oh, for sure. He got so tied by himself reading books that
Right.
he lost his mind.
Yeah, right, exactly, and that's what leads to his madness. And he's no longer able to. Anybody who tries to tell him, no, wait, listen, here's another alternative to view.
Yeah.
He says, no, that can't be true.
Well, and I think that so my favorite reading of The Lord of the Rings is very much the same theme. I mean, brought to almost another massive epic scale is that the idea of the singular is that which is evil. Isolation creates evil, and fellowship and community and the multiplicity creates good and right. So you have the fellowship of people. It's the one ring to bind them. It's the soul tower. It's Gollum in isolation. It is the solo individual isolated creates evil.
Yeah.
And it's only by coming together that we can confront that.
Yeah, I think it's especially interesting coming from the perspective of authors, because these are men and women who probably do spend a lot of time by themselves writing these books,
Yeah.
especially, you know, something like The Lord of the Rings, many hundreds of pages. You know, it's a huge investment of time to write something like that, and just recognize that there is a lot of value in community. There is a lot of value in not allowing yourself to be isolated, or even just on a more practical level. People who struggle with depression very often want to be left alone and want to be isolated because in the moment it feels better.
Yeah.
But anyone around them is going to say, hey, you need to get out. You need to do something. You need to be with other people. This is the best, easiest way to, I suppose, at least distract yourself for a little bit, right? So I think there's so much practical wisdom in not allowing yourself to be isolated.
Which, held up in the book by the fact that the closest Robert actually comes to rejecting Gil Martin's influence is when he's with people,
Right.
who nearly get him to kind of, condemn Gil Martin. And it's always kind of when he leaves the company of people and is sort of on the road alone, and then Gil Martin approaches, and suddenly it all crumbles. And,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then of course, leading to that, they both are convinced that they know that they should do something, and they're not asking anybody for their opinion. Should I do this? And so that conviction that I should do something, Victor believes he should create life. He never stops to ask a scientific community, is this a good idea to do this?
Are you saying that peer review is important?
I am saying that. And I'm saying that just bouncing ideas off other people, whether that's being somebody you're in a relationship with, or a community of friends, or a larger community of peers in your field. I don't think a scientist is necessarily doing their best work when they work alone in a laboratory. And somebody's not there to say, wait a minute, maybe you shouldn't, maybe that's not an avenue you should be going down. That's not, let's take a second here and step back and look at this together. Is that outside perspective is really valuable.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that even heads of state should not act unilaterally without wise counsel?
Historically, yeah. I mean, obviously you're being cynical, yeah, but
Contemporarily, not just historically.
But historically, and in any time we see that, right? Anytime we see somebody who acts as a person who's completely convinced that they understand the right answer, and that nobody else is correct except them, that's obviously a dangerous person.
Yeah.
In my mind, anyway.
Agreed.
Maybe that's where we wrap it up here. Any final closing comments?
I did have, sorry, Scott.
No, go for it.
I did have one thing I didn't get to say. Maybe you guys read this too. But Gil Martin actually comes from potentially like a Scottish phrase that means fox.
Mm-hmm.
So very, very much still focusing on that deceptive nature of Gilmartin. And I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that he is the devil. It's also not too much of a stretch to say that he is Robert, because there are a lot of different points in the book where Robert specifically writes that he feels that they're the same person.
Yeah.
But
what's the difference?
Yeah, in terms of, I guess, if we want to do hot takes here at the end, I'm always a sucker for the metafictional tropes. I guess I like it almost feels like it could have happened, even though we know it certainly didn't, right? But I like that explanation of the found footage in literature. So for me, the book works. I think, unlike Kevin, I guess I would say I do think there are parts in the book that are really funny, right? I laughed out loud a few times, but I came away finding the book to be a lot more disturbing, both in the character of Gilmartin and also in the fact that you do see this satire, admittedly, of extreme beliefs. It's also disturbing, though, because it's not that far afield. You can see that we probably all know some people who are a little bit like this. And with the current political administration, it just feels, it hits home kind of closely.
Yeah, all I'll say by way of closing is I'm more open to the reading of a more universal or relevant commentary. I think I use the word tiresome, which is true of my experience of the book. There were moments where I was like, okay, come on, I get it. But the conversation has made me more willing to credit the book as having a more enduring commentary, and of course, avoid tennis at all costs.
Right, very sinful game.
Yeah.
Sinful games.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm looking down at Kevin's copy right here with, and it looks like one of Goya's black paintings on the cover of the paperback Penguin Classic, which certainly influences the way you read something. When you have something that's that objectively terror, horror, possession, demonic, it will influence the way you read something. And I think what's really cool about this book is what you bring to it will absolutely provide what you get out of it. And I'll go back to my original statement that, to me, the shining example this book provides is its structure and the ingenuity of how it's assembled and how those parts fit together. I think the language itself is fine. A lot of the mechanics of writing is okay. It's not great, but the structure of it to me is absolutely top notch.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's not Shakespeare. It's not like that. It's not poetic language. It's fine, and it produces a lot of interesting ideas in my mind. But as I was reading it, I knew I was reading an older text. And so it wasn't as engaging to me as I was reading it. It felt like more of a study of an older text that would be a hard sell to a contemporary audience who's just reading for pleasure or looking for pick up a book to read on the beach.
Not a beach read at Sandals.
Not a beach read, exactly. But it's definitely it's something I'm glad I know about it now. I'm glad I have it under my belt and I can reference it and I know about it. But I don't think I read it necessarily and got a lot of pleasure out of reading it. But with that said, I did want to mention just real quickly, the one movie I forgot to mention that I feel like we should have mentioned is Fight Club, which is another great example of this kind of
duality.
The split personality, right? When that was the same thing. But I thought it produced a lot of interesting things to talk about, and I wanted to turn it over to Wes, who's going to tell us about our next book.
Yep. We're going to jump into the first book of the Neapolitan novels, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, which is actually a pseudonym. Don't know the author's name. But this has topped a lot of lists for best novels in the 21st century. None of us has read it to this point. I've gotten into it a little bit, and I think it's going to be good. So hop in, read along, and we'll talk about it here in a month or so.
Excellent. And it might be a couple bonus pods thrown out there next month, and then we'll get to that one. And thank you for listening, and keep on reading.
Hey there, podcast family. If you love what you hear on Literary Ramblings, then don't miss out on the chance to join our growing community. Here's how you can help spread the love and support the show. First, make sure you're following us on your favorite podcast platform, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune in. Hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Next, show us some love by liking our episode. It only takes a second, but makes a huge difference in helping us reach more listeners just like you. And finally, if you enjoy a particular episode, share it with your friends, family, and colleagues. Word of mouth is powerful, and your recommendation could introduce someone new to the podcast they have been searching for. Remember, the more followers, likes, and shares we get, the more amazing content we can create for you. So join the conversation and help us grow by following, liking, and sharing Literary Ramblings today.